When I was a kid, my family used to travel all over the country. My parents loved being on the road, and that passion stuck with me and my twin brother, Raymond. It's actually what led us both into trucking. Raymond usually drove a Freightliner Cascadia, while I drove a newer Volvo VNL 860 that the company issued me just a year prior, replacing my older 780. We worked for the same company based in Houston, Texas, and one particular trip still haunts me to this day. I was assigned a long haul from Houston to Los Angeles, and then from there a cross-border run to Vancouver, British Columbia. There was about a week's downtime between dropping off in LA and picking up in Vancouver, so I figured I'd take a little break and visit my cousin who lives out there. I asked Raymond if he wanted to ride along, and he was down. Our boss didn't mind either. The trip to LA was smooth, open highways, beautiful scenery, and plenty of rest stops to break up the drive. The only real headache was the traffic once we actually hit LA, but we managed to navigate through it. We parked the truck at my cousin's place, who has a big property, and spent the next few days just hanging out. We went to beaches, visited landmarks, even made a run to Target to stock up for the next leg of the journey. We left LA late in the evening to avoid traffic, and after a few hours of driving, we got hungry and stopped at a McDonald's at a rest stop. Raymond was behind the wheel while I munched on a cheeseburger. That's when everything took a turn. A sign on the highway said the road ahead was closed. No warning, no detour signs, just a forced exit onto some backcountry road in the middle of nowhere. We figured we'd reconnect to the highway further ahead. But the road just kept going. Would have been flat. Empty fields slowly turned into thick forest. And by midnight, we hadn't seen another vehicle for miles. Eventually, Raymond said he had to pee, so we pulled over to the side of the pitch-black road surrounded by dense trees. There were no lights, no wind, not even the sound of crickets, just dead silence and an awful smell in the air, like rotting meat. While Raymond went off into the woods, I decided to check on the cargo. That smell got stronger, and my curiosity got the best of me. I headed back to the cab to grab a flashlight, but just before I reached the door, I heard a whisper, "Hey, Nick." I turned and saw Raymond walking toward me, looking uneasy. "Did you see that?" he asked. "See what?" I said. He pointed across the road into the trees. There was a light in the woods. Before I could respond, he froze, staring behind me. I turned and saw it too. Through the windshield, barely visible in the moonlight, were what looked like bodies, dozens of them hanging from the trees. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the forest. The beam confirmed what I hoped was just my imagination. There had to be at least a dozen bodies hanging there. Some looked fresh, others decomposing. One looked like it had been gutted, like someone had removed their organs. The sight made me gag, but then I made the mistake of turning off the flashlight, and that's when I saw it, deep in the woods, a faint, flickering light moving closer. Raymond didn't wait. He grabbed my arm, shoved me into the truck. We slammed the doors, started the engine, and tore out of there. As we sped away, I looked in the side mirror. Figures, 5, maybe 10, stood in the road where we had just been parked. One stood out, taller than the others, wearing something on its head. It looked like a mask or maybe a deformed skull. I didn't want to know. We didn't stop until hours later at a truck stop gas station off the highway. While I pumped fuel, Raymond called the police and our boss to report what we'd seen. We still had to make the delivery to Vancouver, so we pushed on with no more detours and no stops unless absolutely necessary, just food and fuel. Weeks later, we learned we may have stumbled into cult territory. Rumors spoke of sacrifices, organ harvesting, ritual killings. They were supposedly active in some of the more remote regions between California and Oregon. None of it ever made the news. After that trip, I couldn't shake the image of those bodies. A few weeks later, I quit my job and took a smaller local gig near my town. Raymond kept driving, but something inside him changed. He still won't talk about that night. After that night, life on the road never felt the same. Every time I got behind the wheel, the memory of those hanging bodies haunted me, lurking at the edge of my vision, like shadows in the periphery. Raymond was distant, quieter than usual, and even when we talked, he dodged any mention of what happened on that backcountry road. Months passed, and though I had switched to a local route, the sense of unease never left me. I found myself driving slower, scanning the trees nervously, always alert for signs that something was out there waiting, watching. My cousin noticed a change in me and tried to help, but I pushed people away. I didn't want to explain the horror I'd seen. It felt like something too dark to share. One night, after a late shift, I stopped at a diner near my hometown to grab a coffee. While sitting alone, I overheard a couple of truckers talking about strange disappearances along the northern routes between California and Oregon. Stories about drivers who vanished without a trace, their trucks found abandoned miles off the highway. It chilled me to the bone. That night, I pulled out my phone and started searching everything I could find about cult activity in that region, but information was scarce, buried under years of silence or dismissed as rumor. I even found a few forums where truckers shared eerie experiences similar to mine. Forced detours onto forgotten roads, strange figures lurking in the woods, unexplainable lights in the distance. It became clear this wasn't an isolated incident. Something was out there, something that thrived in the shadows where no one dared to look too closely. I debated quitting trucking altogether, but the road was all I knew, and despite the fear, I still felt drawn to it in a strange way. Then, one evening while planning my next route, my phone buzzed with a message from Raymond. It was short and cryptic. "We need to talk. Meet me tomorrow night." My heart raced. After all this time, after everything we'd buried, I wasn't sure I was ready, but I knew I had to face it. The next night, we met at a secluded spot by a lake outside town. Raymond looked worn down, haunted even more than I was. He finally spoke about what he'd seen after we left that road, how he kept seeing those figures in his dreams, how he heard whispers calling his name late at night, how the fear had clawed at his mind and wouldn't let go. He told me he'd started researching too, finding connections between that cult and old, unsolved crimes, disappearances, even missing trucks that were never found. We realized we had to dig deeper, not just for ourselves, but for anyone else who might get trapped in their path. So, we made a pact to find out the truth, to expose whatever was hidden in those dark forests no matter the cost. From that moment on, our lives shifted. We started documenting everything, retracing routes, talking to other drivers, gathering evidence. It wasn't just a job anymore. It was a mission to survive and reveal the nightmare lurking just off the beaten path. Our investigation quickly became more intense than we had imagined. We spent nights driving down those back roads, searching for any signs of activity, but the deeper we went, the more we realized how little anyone truly knew. We found abandoned campsites with strange symbols carved into trees, odd remnants of ritualistic fires, and sometimes even discarded personal belongings that didn't match any missing person reports. Talking to locals was a mixed bag. Some denied anything unusual, others whispered warnings to stay away. One old man at a diner told us about a decades-old legend of a cult that worshipped some dark entity tied to those woods, performing sacrifices to maintain their power and silence. The more we learned, the more we understood that the police and authorities either didn't want to get involved or were actively covering things up. One night, while parked near a small town close to the Oregon border, our truck was hit with strange interference, static on the radio, phones losing signal. And when Raymond stepped out to check the perimeter, he swore he saw figures watching from the tree line, their faces hidden, but their presence unmistakable. We didn't sleep that night. Things escalated quickly after that. Our truck was broken into while we were asleep, but nothing was stolen. Instead, all our notes and some of the recorded footage we had collected were destroyed. It was clear they knew we were onto them and wanted to stop us. Despite the fear, we pushed on, determined to gather enough evidence to bring this nightmare to light. We reached out to other truckers who had stories eerily similar to ours. Forced detours, strange lights, unexplained disappearances, and slowly formed a small network of witnesses willing to share their experiences anonymously. As we pieced together their accounts, a chilling pattern emerged, connecting several unsolved missing persons cases across multiple states. But the closer we got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. One night, on a desolate stretch of road, a vehicle began following us, tailing us for hours without making a move. When we finally stopped at a rest area, the car vanished. We reported it to the police, but no action was taken. We knew then this wasn't just a local cult. It had resources, influence, and reach beyond what we could comprehend. The shadows were watching, waiting for a mistake. Yet, with every terrifying encounter, our resolve only grew stronger. We weren't just truckers anymore. We were witnesses, hunters in a silent war against a darkness that hid just beyond the highway's edge, a darkness that threatened to swallow anyone who dared cross its path. And we weren't going to stop until we uncovered every secret those woods held, no matter what it cost us. The tension that had built over months of sleepless nights, constant vigilance, and shadowy encounters finally reached a breaking point when Raymond and I decided to confront the heart of the darkness that had haunted us for so long. Armed with the little evidence we had and a determination born from fear and desperation, we planned a route deep into the forest between Northern California and Oregon, where the cult was rumored to have its stronghold. The closer we got, the heavier the air felt, thick with a silence that pressed against our ears and nerves. Our truck's headlights barely pierced the fog that rolled in like a living thing, wrapping around the trees and swallowing sound. We found signs of recent activity, fresh symbols etched into bark, remnants of fires still warm, and strange offerings left in small piles. As night fell, we parked near a clearing where the trees seemed to close in, and from the shadows emerged figures, not just lurking at the edges but stepping forward, their forms distorted and faces hidden beneath masks or grotesque coverings. Fear tried to paralyze us, but we held our ground. Using a camera and flashlight, we recorded everything, capturing the twisted ritual unfolding before us. Chanting voices, flickering flames, and shadowy movements that felt more like a nightmare than reality. Suddenly, the tallest figure stepped forward, its mask gleaming under the moonlight, and it spoke in a voice that seemed to echo from another world, warning us to leave or become part of the forest forever. Without hesitation, Raymond floored the accelerator, and we tore back down the winding roads, the figures fading into the mist behind us. We knew that night had changed everything. We had proof, but also a target on our backs. We handed over our recordings to a trusted journalist who specialized in uncovering hidden crimes, and slowly the story leaked out. Authorities were forced to investigate, cult activity was exposed, and several arrests were made, though many questions remained unanswered. For Raymond and me, the experience left scars deeper than any physical wound. We quit trucking for good, choosing to live quieter lives far from the highways that once called us. But sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees or a strange light flickers in the distance, I still feel that presence, a reminder that darkness never truly disappears. It just waits, patient and hungry, in the shadows. About 15 years ago, when I was just 13, something happened that still twists my stomach every time I think about it. I grew up on a cattle ranch, isolated and far from any town, deep out in the endless Great Plains. Our house sat 5 miles down a lonely gravel road, surrounded on every side by open pasture with no neighbors nearby. The closest one lived 2 miles away. We were used to being alone out there, far from anyone else. My dad's job involved handling cattle deliveries all the time. Truckers would bring shipments of cattle, and we'd unload them right at the chute. It was routine, normal, something I had done many times before, but never alone. One weekend, my parents took my little sister to Dallas, leaving me behind to accept a late-night delivery all by myself for the first time. I wasn't worried. I was confident. I'd helped with deliveries before. Dad had only given me one piece of advice: never let the driver know I was alone. Midnight passed with no sign of the truck, and around 1 in the morning, I finally spotted headlights way off in the distance. But the truck didn't pull up. Instead, it stopped right in the middle of the gravel road and just sat there for what felt like forever, at least 30 minutes. No one moved, no one got out, only those glaring headlights slicing through the dark. Eventually, the truck slowly started moving again and pulled up next to the loading chute. I went outside to meet the driver, and the moment I saw him, something felt wrong. He looked completely disheveled, clothes dirted and stained like he'd been living in them for days. His eyes were tired but wild, and he mumbled about being late because of a flat tire animals on the road, and fuel issues, though none of it really made sense. Then, out of nowhere, he asked me how old I was. I gave him a vague answer, something like old enough to help out. He stared at me for a long moment, then started rambling about his past in a way that made my skin crawl. He spoke about a girl he used to date, a girl he later found out was related to him, and apparently, he kept seeing her anyway. The story was bizarre, disturbing, and the way he talked wasn't like normal small talk. It felt like he was trying to unsettle me, provoke some kind of reaction. I kept quiet and told him we should start unloading the cattle since my mom was waiting inside. He grumbled, but climbed up to open the first gate and let the cattle off the trailer. I stayed outside, counting the animals as they came down. Then it got stranger. When he opened the second compartment, he went inside the trailer and started fiddling with one of the inner gates. After a minute, he called out, saying he needed help inside. I hesitated. No one ever asks a kid to help inside those trailers. It wasn't normal. I told him I had to stay outside and keep counting. He insisted, but I kept saying no, sensing something was wrong. He was clearly trying to lure me inside that cramped, dark space, and I wasn't having it. After a few back and forths, he finally gave up and opened the gate himself. He used the same tactic with the next two compartments, pretending to need help, growing frustrated each time I refused to enter. By the time all the cattle were off, his mood had changed completely. The overly chatty man had turned angry and short-tempered. Then, as if testing me one last time, he told me to climb up into the cab and get the delivery slip from his glove box. No way was I going to turn my back on him or get into another confined space with him. I told him to get it himself. He stared at me for a long moment, then climbed into his truck, grabbed the slip, and handed it over. I signed it, told him we were done, and as soon as he left, I ran back to the house as fast as I could. From the window, I watched his truck sit out there in the darkness for over an hour before he finally drove away. That delivery should have taken maybe 20 minutes, but it turned into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I still don't know what would have happened if I'd stepped inside that trailer. I'm just grateful I never had to find out. After that night, life on the ranch slowly went back to normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark had brushed against me in that lonely gravel road's cold silence. Days passed, then weeks, and still the image of that disheveled driver haunted my thoughts. I started noticing little things around the house, strange sounds in the wind, fleeting shadows where none should be, and an unshakable sense that I was being watched even when I was alone. One evening, a few days after the delivery, I was outside near the barn when I caught sight of headlights far off in the distance, creeping down the gravel road, just like that night. My heart hammered. Could it be him? But the truck never came closer. It just stopped at the edge of the pasture, the engine idling quietly. Then after a long pause, it disappeared into the darkness without a sound. That was the first time I realized I wasn't just scared of a strange man. I was terrified of what he might have represented, something that didn't belong in this world, something waiting patiently in the shadows to cross the thin line between the mundane and the terrifying. Then came the nights when the cattle began acting strangely, restless and uneasy, lowing mournfully toward the dark horizon, as if sensing an invisible menace. I'd wake up to find the gates to the pastures slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd closed them tight. One night, I heard footsteps crunching through the gravel outside the house, slow and deliberate, stopping right beneath my window. But when I looked out, there was nothing but the empty night. The silence was heavier, oppressive. I wanted to tell my parents, but something inside me kept it bottled up. Maybe the memory of that night made me afraid no one would believe me. Then, weeks later, I found a strange, worn-out photograph tucked behind a loose floorboard in the barn. It showed a man, unmistakably the delivery driver, but his eyes were black, hollow, like empty pits. On the back, scrawled in shaky handwriting, was a name I'd never heard before and a date, over 50 years ago. I tried to tell myself it was just a prank or a coincidence, but the unease grew into dread. I started having nightmares of being trapped inside those cattle trailers, the walls closing in, the driver's distorted voice whispering secrets I couldn't understand. The more I tried to escape the memory, the deeper it seemed to sink into me, as if something had followed that truck into our quiet corner of the plains, something that didn't want to be forgotten. Even now, years later, I sometimes hear a faint rumble on the gravel road at night, and I can't help but wonder if that driver, or whatever he really was, is still out there, waiting in the dark just beyond the edge of the pasture. Time passed, and the feeling of unease grew heavier, almost like a dark cloud hanging over the ranch that I couldn't escape no matter how far I tried to bury it deep inside me. One late autumn evening, as the wind howled through the empty pastures and the sky was thick with low-hanging clouds, I decided to confront my fear. I grabbed a flashlight and headed out alone toward the gravel road where I last saw that truck. The gravel crunched loudly beneath my boots, echoing through the stillness. I was determined to find some answers, some explanation for the man, the photograph, the strange occurrences that had haunted me for months. As I walked further down the road, my breath visible in the cold air, I noticed fresh tire tracks that hadn't been there before, leading off into the brush alongside the road. My heart pounded as I followed them, pushing through the tall grass until I reached a small clearing hidden from the road. There, half buried in dirt and dead leaves, was the rusted shell of an old truck, its windows shattered and body twisted like it had been abandoned for decades. I knelt down and wiped the grime off the door, where a faded logo matched the one I'd seen on the delivery truck that night. Suddenly, the air grew cold and heavy, and the beam of my flashlight flickered. From the shadows just beyond the clearing, I thought I saw movement, a figure standing motionless, watching me. I froze, heart hammering so loud I was sure it would give me away. Then the figure stepped forward, a man with dark, hollow eyes just like the photograph, his clothes filthy and worn, a faint, almost unnatural smile curling on his lips. His voice was low and gravelly as he whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, but the ground beneath me felt like it was shifting, the trees bending closer as if trying to trap me. Behind me, his footsteps followed, slow, deliberate, and growing louder. I barely made it back to the house, slamming the door behind me and locking every lock I could find, but I knew deep down that the darkness from that night hadn't just been a man. It was something else, something that had waited decades for someone to open the door and let it back in. And no matter how far I ran or how fast I hid, I could feel its cold breath on the back of my neck, reminding me that some shadows are not meant to be chased away. They are meant to be endured, forever lurking just beyond the light. After that terrifying night, everything changed. I tried to tell my parents what I had seen, but they just dismissed it as my imagination running wild, tired from too many lonely nights on the ranch. Yet, deep down, I knew what I experienced was real, and worse, it wasn't over. Over the next weeks, strange things kept happening around the property. Tools would disappear only to be found in impossible places. Whispers echoed in the wind that didn't belong to any animal or person, and the cattle grew more restless, sometimes refusing to leave their stalls, as if sensing an unseen threat lurking just beyond the fences. I began to avoid the gravel road entirely, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Then one night, I heard a slow, rhythmic tapping on the window beside my bed. I didn't dare look, but the sound was unmistakable, fingernails scratching against glass. My heart raced as I pulled the covers over my head, trembling. The next morning, outside the window, I found deep scratches gouged into the wooden frame, fresh and jagged, like claws had ripped through it. That was when I understood the truth I'd tried to deny. Whatever had come with that delivery driver had marked me and my home, claiming its place in the empty plains where no one else dared to come. Years passed, but the fear never left. Every so often, I still catch glimpses of headlights far down the gravel road, the unmistakable flicker of a broken truck moving slowly through the darkness. And late at night, when the wind carries the scent of dust and decay, I swear I can hear a voice, low, ragged, whispering secrets meant only for me. I never told anyone the full story again, but I live with the knowledge that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. The darkness waits, patient and eternal, just beyond the edge of the pasture. And sometimes when the night is quiet and still, it reaches in, reminding me that some shadows don't just follow, you carry them inside you forever. About 5 years ago, my husband and I were driving across the country on a long road trip from the East Coast to the West Coast. We had done this drive before, so this time we were just heading back to pick up the last of our belongings and grab our two big dogs. We were exhausted and eager to finish the trip, stopping only for quick bathroom or food breaks. I honestly can't remember which state we were in when it happened. After so many cross-country trips, all the rest stops blur together. It was probably around 3 or 4 in the morning when we pulled into a nearly empty rest area. The parking lot had only one other car and a couple of semis parked in the trucker section. We decided to switch drivers, stretch our legs, and let the dogs out. My husband had been driving, so I told him I'd run to the restroom first while he stayed by the car smoking. The dog area was right near where we parked, but the restrooms were farther off, over a small hill, out of sight from the lot. Even though it was pitch black and eerily quiet, I didn't feel unsafe, but my husband decided to walk with me partway, just to be safe. After I finished, I headed back to let the dogs out while he took his turn at the restroom. I'm not a big or intimidating person. I'm about 5 feet 2 inches, not heavy, but I have two large German Shepherd mixes who are fiercely protective, and I grew up learning self-defense. So even though we were isolated from the main rest stop lights, I wasn't scared. As the dogs sniffed around doing their business, I noticed one of the semis that had been parked on the far end start its engine and slowly move. At first, I thought the driver was just getting back on the highway. I picked up after the dogs and started toward the trash, when suddenly I was blinded by bright high beams. The semi had pulled as close as possible to the dividing line between the truck and car sections, aiming its brights directly at me. I was annoyed and tossed the bags into the trash, squinting into the lights, then turned back toward the car. But then the truck started flashing its lights repeatedly, like it was trying to get my attention. It crept forward slowly, still flashing its brights, and my irritation turned into something else, unease. My dogs picked up on it too. They stopped sniffing and locked their ears up, staring hard at the truck. I got close to our car, and the driver stopped again, still flashing the lights. I wasn't scared yet, just confused and pissed. I stood glaring at him, waiting for him to stop. Eventually, the flashing ceased, and I started pulling out my keys, ready to get into the car. That's when both my dogs froze, their hackles rising as they growled low and menacing. Then I heard a door creak open. I turned and saw the semi's driver's side, door swinging open, a boot stepping out. This guy was actually getting out of his truck. I stood completely still, thinking how stupid this man was, approaching a woman with two large protective dogs, when suddenly my husband returned from the restrooms. He walked straight up to me, put his arm around me, and without hesitation flipped the man off. The trucker paused, then slowly pulled his foot back inside the cab, shut the door, and sped away from the rest area within seconds. Once we were back on the highway, I told my husband about the flashing lights, and he explained something I had never heard before. Apparently, some truckers flash their lights at women at rest stops as a way to signal for hookups. I was disgusted. I wasn't dressed provocatively. I was layered up because it was cold. I was driving a newer car, walking two big dogs, clearly not there to talk to strangers. I wasn't exactly scared, but the whole encounter crossed into creepy territory. The guy clearly thought I was alone, and there was something off about how he approached, not just flirty or weird, but aggressive, like he expected a response. I have creepier stories from our travels, but this one haunts me the most because of how casual it all seemed, like it was just something that guy did all the time. Just another dark, unsettling ritual hidden in the dead of night at a lonely rest stop. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking beneath the surface of those quiet, empty rest stops. It was as if the darkness wasn't just the absence of light, but a veil hiding things we were never meant to see. In the days that followed, every time we stopped at a rest area, I felt eyes on me. Even when surrounded by other people, my dogs would growl at nothing, their fur standing on end, and my husband noticed how jumpy I'd become. What haunted me the most wasn't just that one trucker's creepy approach, but the eerie sense that we'd been watched long before he pulled his truck so close. I started to catch strange glimpses in the shadows, figures that vanished the moment I blinked, reflections that didn't match reality. At night, the highway seemed to hum with a low, mournful sound, like a whisper carried on the wind. One night, parked in a desolate rest stop somewhere in the middle of nowhere, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside the car. My heart hammered as I peeked through the window, expecting to see another restless traveler or a curious animal. Instead, there was a pale figure standing just beyond the headlights, motionless, watching us. I called out, but it disappeared without a sound. The dogs barked furiously, but there was nothing there when we stepped outside. From that moment, I realized the rest stops were not just places to stretch and refuel. They were crossroads where the ordinary and the unsettling collided. We kept moving west, but the weight of those encounters pressed on me, growing heavier with every mile. I began to research, reading old news stories about rest stop disappearances, unexplained sightings, and rumors of men who weren't quite human lurking in the shadows. Each tale added another layer to my growing dread. It was as if something ancient and malevolent had taken root in those forgotten places along the highways. I tried to convince my husband to avoid stops at night, but sometimes exhaustion left us no choice. One late evening, when the sky was a black canvas and the world was silent except for the hum of passing trucks, we pulled into a rest area that felt different. The air was thick, suffocating almost, and the usual sounds of wildlife were absent. Our dogs stiffened instantly, growling low and tense. As we stepped out, I noticed a faded symbol scratched into the concrete near the entrance, something like a twisted spiral that pulsed with a silent warning. That night, sleep evaded me. Shadows seemed to move just beyond the edge of the headlights, and I swore I heard whispering voices calling my name. The next morning, we left in a hurry, not daring to look back. That trip taught me that some roads aren't meant to be traveled lightly, and some rest stops hide secrets better left undiscovered. Even now, years later, the memory of those nights and the feeling of being watched in the dark lingers. The highway may stretch endlessly ahead, but some parts of it will always remain shadowed in fear, and some stories never really end. As the years passed, the memories of that haunting trip never fully faded. Instead, they gnawed at the edges of my mind, resurfacing in the quiet moments when the world seemed too still. We tried to move on, convincing ourselves that what we'd seen and felt were just tricks of fatigue and imagination stretched thin by endless miles of empty roads. But deep down, I knew something had followed us back from those desolate rest stops, something invisible yet unmistakably present. One evening, long after we'd settled into our new home, I noticed the dogs growling at a corner of the living room where nothing was visible to me. Their hackles rose, and they refused to move, their eyes locked on that empty space. I brushed it off as nerves, but unease settled like a heavy fog around me. That night, I dreamed of the pale figure from the highway, the one that had stood silently outside the car. Only this time, it was closer, its hollow eyes boring into me, whispering words I couldn't understand but felt deep in my bones. The next morning, I found strange scratches on the floorboards near where the dogs had been staring, marks that hadn't been there before. Panic began to creep in. It wasn't just the past catching up. It was something that had crossed over, a shadow slipping through the cracks of our world and invading ours. We tried to ignore it, but the incidents multiplied. Lights flickering without cause, cold spots that lingered like invisible breath, and the feeling of being watched even inside our own home. My husband remained skeptical, dismissing it as stress or coincidence. But even he couldn't deny the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to thicken with each passing day. Desperate, I reached out to a local historian who specialized in strange phenomena, hoping to find answers. She told me that many highways and rest stops were built on old grounds, places with dark histories, forgotten tragedies, and restless spirits that clung to the shadows. Some places were known as thin spots, where the veil between our world and the unknown grew dangerously fragile. According to her, encounters like ours were not uncommon, but most people brushed them off, unwilling to face the terrifying truth lurking in the quiet corners of our modern world. I started keeping a journal, documenting every odd event, every unexplained sound, every shadow that seemed to move on its own. The dogs remained our guardians, their instincts sharper than ours, but even they could only do so much against whatever it was that had latched onto us. Then, one night, as a storm raged outside and thunder shook the windows, I woke to the sound of scratching, not on the floor this time, but coming from the walls themselves. My heart raced as the dogs growled fiercely, hackles raised to the max. From the darkness emerged a cold, whispering voice that seemed to seep from the very walls, repeating my name over and over in a chilling monotone. I screamed for my husband, but he was frozen in place, eyes wide with terror, unable to move or speak. The temperature plummeted as the voice grew louder, filling the room with an unbearable weight. It was then I realized that whatever had followed us from those lonely rest stops wasn't done with us yet. It was feeding on our fear, growing stronger with every moment of doubt and silence. We barely escaped that night, fleeing into the storm as if our lives depended on it, because they did. Now, years later, I still feel its presence lurking just beyond the edges of my vision, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. The highways we once traveled so freely are no longer just roads to a destination. They are gateways to something darker, and I fear that one day, if I'm not careful, I'll find myself trapped between the world I know and the shadows that hunger for me still. After that terrifying night, we knew we couldn't stay in that house any longer. We packed what we could in a daze, haunted by the cold whispers and the unseen presence that seemed to claw at the very walls. We left behind everything familiar, desperate to escape the invisible nightmare that had followed us from those cursed rest stops. Moving felt like the only option, but the dread clung to us like a shadow that refused to be shaken off. On the road again, I kept a vigilant watch, refusing to let my guard down for even a moment. Every rest stop we passed brought a wave of panic, a deep-seated fear that the pale figure, the flashing lights, and the creeping darkness would find us once more. My dogs, once full of energy, grew quieter and more watchful, their protective instincts heightened to an almost supernatural degree. My husband, once skeptical, was now a believer, his eyes haunted by sleepless nights and the knowledge that some things are better left unseen. We searched for answers in books, old legends, and obscure forums dedicated to paranormal encounters. I learned about restless spirits trapped by unfinished business and malevolent entities that preyed on travelers, trapped souls that twisted themselves into terrifying forms to lure others into the darkness. Despite all this, the highway called to us, a constant reminder that no matter where we went, the past could follow, trailing shadows behind us like a curse. Years later, I found myself driving again, this time alone, the dogs long gone, but their presence still echoing in my heart. I pulled into a rest stop late at night, the silence thick and heavy, the air colder than it should have been. As I stepped out, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, the lights flickered overhead, and in the corner of my eye, I saw a flicker of movement, a pale figure standing just beyond the edge of the parking lot. My heart pounded, but I stood my ground. I reached into my pocket and touched the small charm my grandmother had given me, a talisman said to protect against evil spirits. I whispered a prayer, and the figure faded into the night like a bad memory. It was a small victory, but enough to remind me that while the darkness is always lurking, there is light to fight it with. The roads we travel may be filled with shadows and whispers, but we carry our own strength, our own light to push back the night. The haunting will never fully leave me, but I have learned to live with it, to recognize the signs, and to protect myself and those I love. The rest stops, the flashing lights, the strange figures, they're reminders that some journeys are not just physical, but spiritual battles fought in silence. And though the fear never truly disappears, I refuse to let it control me. Because sometimes the scariest stories are the ones we survive, and that survival makes us stronger than the darkness that tries to consume us. A couple of summers ago, just after I had turned 18, something happened that still haunts me to this day. Fresh out of high school and halfway through my first year of college, I was living away from home for the very first time. I'd grown up pretty sheltered, so being alone on the road and in the world was still a new experience. I'm a woman, which will become important as this story unfolds. It was mid-May, and I was driving home from my brother's wedding. My school was several states away, and I had a long, lonely drive ahead. I was about an hour out from my college town, cruising down Interstate 40 somewhere in Tennessee, traffic heavy, but nothing out of the ordinary. The sun was bright, the sky clear, and then I noticed something strange in my rearview mirror, a semi-truck a little ways behind me in the right lane. Nothing unusual at first, until I saw the truck's headlights flashing repeatedly. I thought maybe the driver wanted to pass or merge, so I sped up and changed lanes to give him room, but he stayed right behind me, not letting any other cars come between us. Then he flashed his lights again. I glanced up, and he waved, then honked his horn. That's when a cold shiver ran down my spine. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe he was trying to warn me about something wrong with my car. I'd patched a tire just a week before, and suddenly I panicked that maybe it was flat or about to blow. The next exit was coming up, so I decided to pull off, planning to check my car at a gas station just off the ramp. I didn't expect the truck to follow me, but it did. It pulled into the truck parking area, and that's when I knew something was very wrong. I got out quickly and walked around my car, checking the tires, but everything seemed fine. No smoke, no strange noises. Still, he was already climbing down from the cab and heading toward me. My heart hammered in my chest as I stayed by my car with my phone in hand, already dialed the 911, but not daring to press call. I positioned myself half behind the open driver's door, using the gas hose as a makeshift barrier between us. He stopped a few feet from the back of my car, a man in his late 30s or early 40s, maybe 170 pounds. I was 18, barely 125 pounds, not exactly in any kind of shape to defend myself. His first words sent a chill through me. "Well, ain't you a pretty little thing?" My stomach dropped. Every part of my brain screamed in warning, but I smiled tightly and said, "Thanks," trying not to show how scared I was. He offered to pay for my gas, but I refused, not wanting to owe him anything. Then the question started. Where was I from? Where was I headed? Was I in college? Instinctively, I lied about everything, gave him a fake hometown, a fake school, told him I was just on a short trip visiting family nearby. He didn't press further, but he didn't leave either. Maybe it was the faint glow of the 911 screen on my phone that made him hesitate, or maybe just my luck, but when the pump clicked off, I thanked him again, got in, and drove away as fast as I dared without drawing attention. He didn't follow me back onto the highway. I never saw his truck again. I have no idea what his real intentions were. Maybe he was just a creepy man trying to flirt in the worst way possible. Or maybe it could have been something much darker if I hadn't trusted my gut. I never reported it, and that is one of my biggest regrets. I wanted to forget it and move on, but since that day, I've never looked at truck drivers the same way. Every time I see a big rig on the road, I remember the flashing lights, the honking, the man's chilling words, and how close I came to a nightmare. I can barely even put in a word that IT took months before I stopped checking my mirrors obsessively every time I got on the highway, but deep down, I never really let it go. Something about that day never sat right with me. The memory would resurface at the worst moments, in the dark, in empty parking lots, or when I was driving alone late at night. Then last summer, almost exactly a year later, I was driving a similar route back to school after visiting family. This time, I had taken a different path, hoping to avoid the old stretch of I-40 altogether, but my GPS rerouted me due to construction, and somehow I ended up on the same road again. I told myself it was fine, just a coincidence, nothing to be afraid of. It was late afternoon, the sky overcast, traffic light, and I tried to stay calm. But then I noticed a semi-truck in my rearview mirror. It wasn't close at first, just a shape in the distance, but something about it felt familiar. I told myself not to panic, but my heart was already thudding against my ribs. I changed lanes, trying to lose it, but it followed. Not fast, not aggressive, just constant. No flashing lights this time. No honking. Just the truck staying steadily behind me for miles. I started to feel that same cold dread building in my stomach. At one point, I took an exit I hadn't planned to, just to see if he'd keep going straight, but he exited too. I drove past gas stations and open lots, searching for a place with people, with light, but everything felt too quiet, too isolated. Eventually, I found a diner with a few cars in the lot and pulled in fast, cutting the engine and grabbing my phone, pretending to talk on it as I sat there watching. The truck kept driving. It passed me slowly and then disappeared down the road. I thought maybe I'd imagine it all, just nerves and bad memories. But when I got out of the car to go inside the diner, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. There, tucked beneath my windshield wiper, was a small strip of yellow paper. It had no words, just a smudged black fingerprint pressed into the center of it. I looked up and down the road, but the truck was gone and no one in the diner had seen anything. I didn't call the police. I didn't know what to say. I just got back in the car and drove until I couldn't think anymore, until I reached the city limits and lights and noise and people. Since then, I've started locking my car even while driving, checking beneath it before I get in, avoiding highway stops whenever I can. Because maybe it really was just a coincidence. Maybe I let my fear get the best of me. Or maybe someone out there remembered me and wasn't done yet. I tried to move on after that second encounter, but something had shifted subtly at first, like the air felt different around me, heavier, like I was being watched. I stopped taking long trips alone. I avoided highways entirely. I even got a dash cam and made sure my phone was always charged, but the fear never really left. It followed me into my dreams, into every moment of silence, but I kept telling myself I was being paranoid until last month. I was walking to my car after a late shift at the bookstore where I work, the parking lot mostly empty, the air unusually still. I remember hitting the unlock button on my key fob and hearing the beep, and then noticing something off about the driver's side window. It was clean. Too clean. I hadn't washed the car in weeks, but there was a clear handprint smeared across the glass, as if someone had leaned in, looking. My stomach dropped. I checked the doors locked. I checked under the car. Nothing. I even scanned the lot, but there was no one, nothing, just that eerie silence and the rows of cars sitting like shadows. I got in and drove home fast, hands shaking the whole way. That night, I dreamt of a highway swallowed in fog, my car crawling forward with no end in sight, and behind me, always just behind, headlights that never blinked. When I woke up, I found a text on my phone from an unknown number. No words, just a single photo. It was the back of my car, taken from behind, in my apartment's parking lot. My plate was clearly visible. So was the sticker from my school. I called the police then, finally, and filed a report. They took it seriously at first, checked the cameras, traced the number, but nothing came of it. The footage was corrupted somehow, and the number was a burner. They told me to stay vigilant, maybe get a restraining order if anything escalated, but how do you file a restraining order against a shadow? Against the silence that follows you home? I started staying with friends, never parking in the same place twice, but the feeling only got worse, like something was closing in. And then just 3 nights ago, I woke up to a sound outside my window, a low, heavy hum like an engine idling. I live on the 3rd floor. There's no reason I should have heard anything so clearly, but I did. When I looked through the blinds, I couldn't see a truck. I couldn't see anything, but the sound was there, constant, vibrating through the floor. It lasted for maybe 10 minutes. Then it stopped, just gone. And the next morning, on my windshield again, was another piece of paper. No fingerprint this time, just 5 typed words, barely legible, like they'd been printed on a dying machine. You look back too late. I haven't gone to work since. I haven't slept more than an hour at a time. Because now I'm starting to think this isn't just some man. I think it started as a man, something human. But whatever is after me now doesn't feel human anymore. It feels older, colder, patient, like it's not chasing me for fun or obsession. It's waiting for something. And deep down, I think I already know what it's waiting for, me to stop running. I didn't leave my apartment for 2 days after that last message. Barely moved from the couch. Phone in hand, curtains drawn tight, every light on, as if brightness could somehow keep it out, whatever it really was. I kept thinking about the words. You look back too late, over and over until they didn't even feel like English anymore, until they felt like a warning written in a language that my body understood more than my brain, something old and instinctual, like prey sensing a predator that never makes a sound. On the 3rd night, something in me broke. I realized I couldn't hide forever. I had to end this, or at least face it, whatever it was. So I drove. I got in my car just before midnight, no destination, just the open road, the interstate, the place where it all began. I thought maybe if I went back, if I retraced the route, I'd find answers or I'd find him. The truck, the eyes behind the wheel. I drove for hours deep into Tennessee, the roads empty and dark, and with every mile I felt it growing closer, the weight in my chest thickening, the air getting colder even though my heater was on full blast. At 3:17 a.m., I saw it, parked on a shoulder, hazard lights blinking slowly like a dying heartbeat. A familiar rig, but different, older, rusted around the edges, almost rotting. And standing in front of it, facing the road, was a man, or something shaped like one. He didn't move. I slowed down. I don't know why. Maybe because I wasn't afraid anymore. Maybe because I knew fear was useless now. As I passed, I looked out the window, and he looked back. His eyes weren't eyes. They were hollow, shadowed sockets that seemed to pull everything in like a void, and inside that emptiness, I saw myself. Not just my reflection, but all the moments I had doubted my instincts, all the times I'd ignored the chills, silenced my fear, told myself I was overreacting. I saw every version of me that could have died that day at the gas station. And then he smiled, not with lips, but with presence, like the curve of a grin stitched into the shape of the night. My radio cut out. The engine stuttered. And suddenly, I wasn't on the road anymore. I was somewhere else. Endless black asphalt under a starless sky. The truck behind me, idling forever. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was seen. Then, just as suddenly, I was back, headlights of a passing car blinding me as I realized I was parked on the shoulder miles past where the truck had been, no memory of stopping. My phone was dead. My clock blinking midnight. And written across my windshield, in something dark and thick and still wet, were the words, "Next time, don't look away." I left the highway. I drove until dawn. I've deleted all my social media. I've changed my name. I don't tell people where I'm from. And still, sometimes, late at night, when I hear a low hum in the distance, I wonder if I ever actually left that road. If I ever really made a home. Or if that version of me, the girl who thought she could drive away from fear, is still out there, headlights in her mirror, just waiting to look back. I was driving back to college alone one Sunday evening, the sky dimming as dusk rolled in, just me and my dad's old pickup truck and a stretch of near-empty highway ahead. I'm not exactly intimidating, barely 5 feet 3 inches, 21 years old, and I was just zoning out to music, singing like an idiot, when I noticed a semi-truck creeping up in the far right lane, going exactly my speed. It felt weird, especially when I tried to speed up, and he did too, always matching me no matter what I did. Then he merged closer into the center lane and kept smiling, waving, at first friendly, then too friendly, then wrong. He blocked me whenever I tried to change lanes, trapping me between cars like he was playing a game only he understood. 4 or 5 miles, he stayed with me, watching me, waving, smiling, sometimes holding up one finger like he was signaling something only he knew. My stomach turned, and I finally called 911, gave a full description, everything I could see, white trailer, black cab, Pennsylvania plates, but the dispatcher's advice to pull onto the narrow shoulder didn't feel safe. Then he got stuck behind a slower car, and I shot ahead, took 2 quick lane switches, and finally escaped him. For a second. The dispatcher said to exit at the next service plaza. I did, but somehow he knew. He followed without signaling, without hesitation. He trailed me off the highway and into the lot, and I watched as his truck took the long back route where semis had to go, circling around the building, never breaking eye contact. I didn't want to sit and wait like prey, so I pulled out to the nearby gas station where I could watch from afar. I was still on the phone with dispatch when I saw him. He'd left the truck, walked toward the plaza, then stopped behind a concrete pillar, just standing there, watching my truck like he was waiting for something. When he stepped out and started walking toward my vehicle, smiling that same twisted smile, I couldn't take it. I floored it and tore out of the lot, heart racing, dispatcher still in my ear, telling me officers are on their way, but I needed to get home. I never found out what happened to him, if they caught him or not. But weeks later, I did something even dumber. I snuck out late one night, walking alone through my neighborhood, looking for a weed stash someone had hidden, with just my boyfriend on video call and a phone running low on battery. I didn't bring anything to protect myself, not the pepper spray my dad always told me to carry, not even the tiny keychain alarm. And as I crossed some poorly lit tracks near the edge of town, I saw a semi-truck parked where they often were. I thought nothing of it until I heard, "Hola, hey." A man leaned out, smiling too wide, too eager, wearing red, his smile all wrong. I waved, said I didn't speak Spanish, and kept walking, trying to laugh it off with my boyfriend, trying to forget that twist in my gut. I searched for nearly an hour, never found the stash, and started heading back. But the darkness on the road I came from felt heavier now. I turned, chose the brighter path by the warehouse. That's when I heard it again, "Hey." I turned, and there he was, the same truck driver, stepping out from behind a trailer like he'd been waiting the whole time, hand in his pocket, smile gone sharp and dangerous. He motioned to me to come closer. I backed away, told my boyfriend to wake up his dad, to come get me. When the man realized I was on the phone, his whole face changed. Anger, frustration, something else I can't name. He slipped back behind the trailers, hiding again, hunting again. I ran, full sprint, toward a mini-mart, ducked behind an ice machine, called a friend, whispering my fear while watching the semi cruise by, slowly, scanning, searching for me. He paused, shook his head in disappointment, and drove off. But I didn't feel safe until my friend pulled up and his girlfriend reached over to hold my shaking hand. That night shattered something in me. I had believed I was invisible, not pretty enough, not thin enough, not the type that predators noticed. But none of that mattered. They don't see your confidence, your logic, your armor. They see opportunity. And I was lucky, so lucky, to get away. But I still see his smile in my dreams. Weeks passed, but the fear lingered like smoke that never cleared. And every time I saw a semi on the road or heard a diesel engine growl, something inside me tightened like a fist. I kept telling myself it was over, that lightning doesn't strike twice, that I was just being paranoid, but deep down, I knew better. It started again on a quiet Thursday night when I left my night class a little later than usual. The parking lot was mostly empty, and my truck sat under a flickering light that cast long, shivering shadows. I got in, locked the doors out of habit, and started the engine. That's when I saw it. In the rearview mirror across the lot, tucked just behind a cluster of trees, the unmistakable glow of twin headlights, too high off the ground to be anything but a semi. It wasn't moving, just idling there like it was waiting. I shook it off, drove away, told myself it wasn't him, couldn't be him. But that same night, parked outside my apartment, I saw a red long-sleeve shirt crumpled under a bush near the entrance, stained with something dark. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't touch it, didn't go near it. I just ran inside and locked the door, checked the windows twice, then sat on my bed clutching a kitchen knife I'd never used before. The next few days, little things started happening. My back tires were slashed while parked on campus. A deep scratch ran down the length of the driver's side door, and someone left a single glove, black, worn, too big, on my windshield under the wiper blade. No one believed me when I told them it was connected, that it was him. My boyfriend said I needed to take a break from horror podcasts, that I was spiraling. But I knew. I could feel him watching. It wasn't just paranoia. It was presence, like a storm waiting just over the horizon. I started carrying pepper spray in one hand and a screwdriver in my bag, rehearsing what I'd do if I ever saw him again. Then, one night, I came home and found my apartment doors slightly open, not broken, just ajar as if someone had turned the knob from the inside and left it waiting. I backed away and called the police, hands shaking, and they came, searched everything, found nothing. But something was off. The way my bedroom window was unlocked when I always kept it shut. The way the bathroom mirror had a smudge like a fingerprint dragged in a slow arc across the glass. Still, no forced entry, no evidence, so they left me with a warning to be careful and a number to call if anything else happened. That night, I slept in the bathtub with the door locked and my phone clutched in one hand. I didn't go to class the next day. I couldn't. The fear had grown legs, followed me room to room, breathing down my neck. I started to wonder if he ever left town or if he'd always been circling, waiting for me to let my guard down again. Then came the letter. No envelope, just folded paper shoved under my door with a crude drawing in black ink. My truck, a girl inside, and a tall figure outside the driver's window. No words, just that sketch, and a smile drawn too wide. I moved back in with my parents that night, told them everything, even the parts I'd kept hidden. My dad barely said a word, just went out to the shed and came back with a hunting rifle and a pack of fresh batteries for the motion lights. But I knew even that wouldn't stop him. Because the thing about predators is that once they choose you, once they mark you, they don't always stop when you run. They follow. And sometimes they don't want to hurt you right away. Sometimes they won't watch first, learn your patterns, wait until you're alone again, in the dark and the silence, with nowhere left to hide. The first week back at my parents' house passed in uneasy silence, the kind that creeps in after a storm but before the next one hits, and I tried to pretend things were normal. To eat dinner at the table, to laugh when my mom made jokes, to sleep through the night without jumping at every creak of the floorboards or flicker of headlights passing outside. But the truth was I hadn't felt normal since that first moment on the highway, since that first too friendly wave, and now everything felt like a countdown. I kept my phone charged at all times, kept the curtains drawn, the doors double locked, and I started noticing things again. Small, dismissible things if I hadn't lived this before. The neighbor's dog, normally calm, barking at nothing near the edge of the woods. Tire tracks leading through our gravel driveway, not matching any of our vehicles. A cigarette but near the back porch, even though no one in the house smoked. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe I dropped it, maybe the dog barked at a raccoon, maybe someone had just turned around in our drive. But then one night, the motion lights behind the garage clicked on, and I froze mid-step in the kitchen, eyes glued to the back window. Nothing moved. No shadows. No footsteps. Just light, burning into the dark. I stood there until it shut off. Then I waited another hour before going to bed. And that was when I heard it. A tap. Soft, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. From the window next to my bed. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Just stared into the curtains, heart thudding like war drums in my chest. I knew that rhythm. That kind of tapping isn't random. It's a signal, a taunt. I wanted to scream, but couldn't make a sound, not even when I heard the tap again, lower this time like someone was crouching. I reached for my phone and texted my dad. Too afraid to speak, just 4 words, "He's in my window." My dad came bursting in with the rifle, flung the curtains open, but by then, of course, there was no one there. Just our backyard stretching into woods and the soft moonlight making everything look peaceful and wrong. My mom cried, my dad searched the property, and I sat on the floor with my back to the wall, feeling like I was unraveling. The police came again. They checked everything again. And once again, there was no evidence, no prints, no signs of forced entry or anyone outside. I could see the pity in their eyes, the way they wondered if maybe I was just traumatized, imagining things. But I knew he was playing with me. The next morning, we found something tucked beneath the windshield wiper of my truck again, another drawing. This one was of a house. Our house. My bedroom window marked with an X. This time, we didn't wait. My parents installed security cameras, motion alarms, new locks, everything. I stopped sleeping in my room, stayed in the guest room next to their bedroom, where I could at least pretend to be safe. But even with all that, even surrounded by walls and protection, I still woke up some nights convinced I heard someone whispering my name from just outside the door. It all came to a head one night when the power went out. A storm was coming, thick black clouds rolling in, and the power flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging the house into a smothering silence. The security system went down with it. My dad grabbed his flashlight. My mom lit candles, and I tried not to panic. But then we heard it, a loud crash from the garage. My dad ran out, and I followed, heart in my throat. The back door had been forced open, the lock split, hinges twisted. And on the wall, scrawled in black spray paint, just 3 words, "I found you." We didn't wait for police this time. My dad loaded the truck, and we left before the rain even hit, drove straight through the night to a motel 2 towns over while officers investigated. But I couldn't shake the feeling, not even in a new place, that it wasn't over. That this wasn't just a sick game, but something deeper. I started wondering why me, why he had chosen me out of everyone. And then I remembered the look in his eyes that first day, like he recognized something, like he already knew me. And then I remembered something else, something I had buried years ago, back when I was a kid riding my bike near the truck stop on the edge of town. A man had waved at me then too, a man in a red long-sleeve shirt. I had thought it was nothing, a stranger being nice. But what if it wasn't? What if he had seen me all those years ago and decided I was his? What if I'd been marked a long time ago, long before I even knew to be afraid? What if this wasn't the beginning, but the middle of something I never understood until now? We didn't go home after the motel, not really, not in the way you go back to a place believing it's still yours, still safe, still untouched by something that doesn't belong. Because home had changed, or maybe I had, and all I could feel was that he was still out there, watching, waiting, knowing where I'd been before I did. So we left town entirely, moved in with my aunt across the state where no one knew us. No one recognized my truck, and I traded in my phone, deleted my accounts, started fresh, as if erasing digital footprints could scrub away the eyes I still felt on the back of my neck. And for a while, things were quiet, too quiet, like the world was holding its breath waiting for me to let mine out. But I never fully did, because I knew this wasn't over, because some nightmares don't end, they adapt. And then came the package, a small brown box with no return address that arrived at my aunt's doorstep one morning in late fall. And when I opened it, hands trembling, stomach knotted, I found only one thing inside. A photograph, aged and bent, of me as a child riding my pink bike past the old truck stop, the one from all those years ago. And behind me, barely visible in the background, was the same semi-truck, the same shape, the same color, parked beneath the same flickering light. Like a ghost that had been hiding in my memories this whole time and was now reminding me that it had always been real, and worse, that it had always been watching, always been close, always been patient. We called the police again, handed over the package, but they had nothing to go on, no prints, no camera footage from delivery trucks, nothing but a sickening sense that we were being toyed with, that I was being hunted like a game stretched out over years. And for the first time, my parents admitted they were scared too, not just for me, but because this man, whoever he was, had turned obsession into art, into ritual, and if we didn't break the cycle, it would never end. So we did what desperate people do. We ran again, changed names, new IDs, new state. My dad sold the pickup. I cut my hair, dyed it black, stopped using social media completely. I even stopped walking alone, took self-defense classes, carried mace, a taser, a pocket knife. Even though I knew deep down that none of it would matter if he really wanted to find me again. Because the truth I'd come to accept, the one that kept me awake at night, was that I hadn't been randomly chosen. I had been followed, cataloged, claimed by something older than just human malice, something patient and methodical, the kind of evil that doesn't need to rush because it enjoys the waiting. And when I asked myself why me, why this long, I started remembering more flashes from childhood, nightmares I brushed off. A recurring dream I used to have where a man would watch me through the window, smiling, always smiling. And I realized I hadn't forgotten anything. I had suppressed it, buried it, because sometimes your mind protects you from what your soul already knows. But the first time I saw him wasn't on that highway or in that alley, but long before, when I was small and too naive to understand that monsters don't always wear fangs or hide under beds. Sometimes they wear faded shirts and sit behind wheels, learning your routes, your habits, your fears, and when you finally look them in the eyes, it's not the first time you've met. It's the first time you remember. And now I remember everything. And even though I haven't seen him again, not yet, I know he's out there, watching from a distance, letting me believe I've escaped so he can enjoy the dread of knowing that someday, when I least expect it, maybe at a gas station or a rest stop or through the crack of a motel curtain, I'll see that truck again, and he'll be smiling. And I'll understand that some horror stories don't have endings, only pauses, and mine is still playing.